The morning Lydia Walker drove the last fence post into the cracked earth of her dead husband's land, she swore to God and every empty horizon around her that she would never let another man tell her what she needed. The year was 1878, and the panhandle of Texas was not a place that forgave weakness. The wind came down from the north like something with a grudge, and the sun baked everything else into leather. The town of Harlan's Creek sat 23 miles east, a collection of clapboard buildings and sun-bleached ambitions that called itself civilized only because it had a church and a jail and a man who claimed to be a doctor. Lydia's land, her land now, officially, as of 3 weeks past when the deed had transferred into her name following Robert Walker's burial, sat on the western edge of decent grazing country, where the grass thinned out and the sky got bigger, and the silence pressed against you like a living thing. Robert had been 34 years old when a rattlesnake took him while he was pulling a calf from the mud near the creek bed. It was not a heroic death. It was not a poetic death. It was the kind of death that happened in this country all the time, sudden and indifferent, and Lydia had stood over his grave with dry eyes that frightened the preacher and steady hands that frightened everyone else. She had been 26 years old, married for 4 years, and she had learned a great deal about silence in those 4 years. Robert had not been a cruel man. That was what people said at his funeral, and Lydia had nodded along because it was true as far as it went. He had not been cruel. He had been certain. Certain about where the cattle should graze and how the accounts should be kept, and what Lydia should wear to church, and which neighbors were worth talking to, and how a woman ought to carry herself in a town where men made every meaningful decision. He had been certain the way a wall is certain, solid and immovable, and not interested in what was on the other side of it. She had spent 4 years pressing her palms against that wall, and when the wall was gone, she had stood in the open air of her own life and breathed, actually breathed, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. Now there was the matter of the ranch. 312 acres of grassland and creek-fed pasture, 41 head of cattle, a barn that needed new boards on the south-facing wall, and a fence line that stretched 3/4 of a mile along the northern boundary, where the land abutted the Garrett property. The Garrett property was a different matter entirely. Jedediah Garrett had come to Harlan's Creek 2 years before Lydia and Robert, back in 1870, when he was 22 years old and possessed of a horse, a bedroll, $200 he'd earned working cattle drives from San Antonio, and what the town quickly recognized as an unusual quality of stillness. He was not a man who talked much. He was not a man who moved fast. He was not a man who seemed to need much from anyone. He had purchased 460 acres adjoining the land that would eventually become Walker land, had built himself a small, sturdy house, had acquired a modest herd, and had proceeded to run his operation with a quiet competence that the other ranchers respected, and the women in town found alternately intriguing and frustrating, because a man who was not trying to impress anyone was genuinely difficult to read. He was 30 years old now, dark-haired and lean, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work and a pair of gray eyes that had a habit of looking at things very directly and very calmly, as if he had made peace with most of what the world contained and was simply observing whatever remained. He was not what anyone would call handsome in the conventional, showy way. But there was something in the quality of his presence, the way he occupied space without demanding it, the way he listened without immediately formulating a response, the way he seemed to have some interior reservoir of patience that never quite ran dry, that made people feel, in his company, that things were probably going to be all right. Lydia Walker did not want to feel that things were going to be all right. She wanted to feel that she was going to make them all right herself. This was the state of affairs on the morning in late September when the fence line between the Garrett property and the Walker property finally gave way in 3 separate places after a week of unseasonable rain followed by 2 days of hard wind. The posts had been rotting for longer than anyone had admitted, and the wire had gone slack in sections, and 41 head of Walker cattle were now distributed across both properties in a pattern that suggested they had absolutely no opinion about whose grass they were eating. Lydia discovered this at first light when she rode out to check on the herd after the storm and found exactly 11 of her cattle in the vicinity of where they were supposed to be. She sat on her horse, a broad-chested bay mare named Clara, and looked at the broken fence line with an expression that would have curdled milk. She did not go to town for help. She did not send word to a neighbor. She tied Clara to the surviving portion of fence post nearest the first break, went back to the barn, loaded a wagon with post-hole digger and wire and hammer and staples and replacement posts she had been meaning to set for 2 months, and drove back out to the fence line herself. She had been working for approximately 90 minutes, her hands bleeding in 2 places where the wire had bitten her through her gloves, the post-hole digger having encountered approximately the most uncooperative layer of caliche rock in the history of the Texas panhandle, when she heard hoofbeats. She did not look up. She knew whose land was on the other side of this fence. She knew the hoofbeats of a horse moving at an easy, unhurried pace across ground it knew well. She kept her hands on the post-hole digger and kept working. "Morning," said Jedediah Garrett. "Morning," said Lydia Walker, and did not look up. She heard him dismount. She heard the creak of leather. She heard him move along the fence line, probably assessing the damage, and she kept her jaw tight and her eyes on the work in front of her because she was not going to look up and she was not going to ask for help and she was not going to behave as though she needed anything from the man on the other side of this fence. "Storm took out 3 sections," he said. It was not a question. It was not a suggestion. It was simply a statement of observable fact. "I know," said Lydia. There was a pause. Not an uncomfortable pause exactly, but a considered one. "I've got posts in my barn," he said. "I have posts," she said. Another pause. "All right," he said. She expected him to leave. Most men, finding a woman clearly engaged in hard work and clearly uninterested in assistance, would have said their piece and moved on and told the story later as evidence of female stubbornness. Jedediah Garrett did not leave, but he also did not offer again, and he did not give advice about the angle of the post-hole digger or the depth of the holes or anything else. What he did, after a moment that Lydia spent fully focused on the iron tool in her hands, was ride his horse along the fence line toward the second break, which was about 40 yards east of where she was working. She glanced up then just once and saw him dismount near the second break and begin pulling his horse's saddlebag open. He had apparently come out prepared. He had wire cutters. He had wire. He had staples. He crouched down near the broken section and began working. Lydia looked back at her own section and felt something move through her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated and less comfortable than gratitude. It was the feeling of having braced yourself against something and finding that the something was not pushing. She drove the post into the ground. She ran the wire. She hammered the staples in with 3 clean strokes each because she had learned over the past 3 weeks that if you hesitated on the downswing you wasted energy and bruised your palm. She moved to the second post, and then to the third. From 40 yards away, she could hear Jedediah working. He worked with the same kind of quiet efficiency she was attempting to work with herself. No wasted motion, no cursing at the wire, no dramatics. Just the steady sound of someone doing a job that needed doing. It took her 2 hours to repair her section of fence. When she was finished, she stood back and looked at it, and it was solid. It was good work. She was breathing hard and her hands were sore and her back ached from the post-hole digger, and she felt, underneath all of that, a satisfaction that was perfectly her own. She gathered her tools and loaded them back into the wagon. She walked along the fence line toward where Jedediah was finishing up on the second break, because the third break was further east and she needed to get there and she was going to have to pass him. He was crouching, driving the last staple, and he looked up when she approached. There was no assessment in his gray eyes. He was not looking at her the way men in Harlan's Creek looked at her, the way that calculated widowhood against available land and decided what category she fell into. He was just looking at her, steady and even. "Third break is yours to do if you want it," he said. "It's on your side of the line. I can do it or I can leave it." "I will do it," she said. "All right," he said. He stood up, gathered his tools, and went to his horse. He remounted without flourish. He looked at her one more time, and she thought for a moment that he might say something else, something well-meaning and useless, something about how she was holding up or whether she needed anything or the particular loneliness of a widow's first season. Men always said those things, and they always said them because they needed to say them, not because she needed to hear them. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode back across his own land, and Lydia watched him go for exactly 5 seconds before she turned her wagon toward the third break in the fence. She fixed that section herself, and it was the best work of the 3. That evening, sitting at the table in the house that was finally entirely hers, she had moved Robert's chair to the barn and bought herself a second chair she liked better from the mercantile in Harlan's Creek. She ate her supper and thought about the gray-eyed man who had fixed the fence on his side of the line and left her alone. She had lived in Harlan's Creek for 4 years, and she knew Jedediah Garrett by sight, and by the general reputation the town accorded him, which was good man, reliable, keeps to himself, paid his debts on time, helped during the Thompson barn fire 2 years past without being asked, never made trouble at the saloon because he did not frequent the saloon, had once driven Mrs. Henley 23 miles to the doctor in Amarillo when her husband was away and she had taken sick, and had returned her home without making anything of it whatsoever. This was the consensus portrait, and it was generally favorable. Lydia was not interested in a favorable portrait. She was interested in being left alone to run her ranch, which she was going to do successfully and without assistance, and which she was in the process of demonstrating to herself and to the watching, opinionated population of Harlan's Creek. The problem, she discovered over the following 2 weeks, was that running a ranch alone in 1878 Texas was a project that generated approximately 47 tasks for every 12 hours of daylight, and several of those tasks required either a second pair of hands or an unreasonable stubbornness that even Lydia occasionally ran up against. The south wall of the barn, for instance. The boards had warped and split during the wet season and needed to be replaced before winter came in earnest, which it would do in approximately 6 weeks if the weather patterns held. Lydia could nail boards. She had nailed many boards. The difficulty was that the boards at the top of the south wall were 12 feet off the ground, which meant a ladder, and a ladder with no one holding it while she worked at the top was a ladder that moved independently in ways that were both inconvenient and genuinely dangerous, as she discovered on a Tuesday morning when the ladder skidded 18 inches sideways on the damp ground, and she grabbed the eaves with both hands and hung there for a moment of pure, clarifying fury before pulling herself up onto the barn roof. She sat on the barn roof for several minutes. From the barn roof she could see most of her land, the brown and gold of the autumn grass, the cattle moving in the distance, the thin silver line of the creek where it bent around the eastern pasture. She could also see, because his land was adjacent, a portion of Jedediah Garrett's operation, the neat line of his corral fence, the dark shape of his barn, which was larger than hers and appeared to have been recently painted, and the small figure of the man himself moving near the corral with, she noted, an unhurried and purposeful stride. She climbed back down the side of the barn by a route she invented on the spot, using the window frame of the hayloft and a rusted iron bracket she was going to have to do something about, and she retrieved the ladder and moved it and jammed a large flat stone under its base, and she went back up and replaced the boards she could reach from that position, which was most of them, and the remaining 2 upper boards she decided were not as critical as they had initially appeared. It was a decision she revisited at 2 in the morning 3 days later, when she woke to the sound of wind, finding a gap where boards had been and coming through the gap with a cold, insistent howl. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought very deliberate, calm thoughts about the situation. In the morning she drove the wagon to town. She went to the mercantile for the flour and salt and lamp oil she had been meaning to get for a week, and she went to the feed store for oats, and she was loading the oats into the back of the wagon when she became aware of Jedediah Garrett standing outside the hardware store across the street, talking to Buck Delaney, who ran the livery. She went on loading oats. She was not watching him. She happened to notice, in the way that people notice the general landscape around them, that he said something to Buck Delaney, and that Buck Delaney laughed, and that Jedediah did not laugh exactly but smiled in a way that changed the configuration of his face quite considerably for a brief moment. He glanced across the street. She did not look away in time, and for a moment they looked at each other across the dusty main street of Harlan's Creek, and Jedediah nodded once, the way people in small western towns acknowledge each other's existence, and Lydia nodded back, and then she turned and climbed up onto the wagon seat and drove home. Clara, her mare, had a habit of flicking her left ear back when she felt the reins tighten, and Lydia became aware of this only because she was holding the reins rather more tightly than necessary for most of the drive home. She let herself into the house, put the supplies away, and stood in the middle of her kitchen, which was a good kitchen, with a cast-iron stove that drew well and a table she had scrubbed to whiteness, and a window that looked east toward the creek, and she told herself a series of practical truths. She was 26 years old. She was a widow. She was running a cattle operation alone in the panhandle of Texas, and she was managing. She had repaired the fence herself and replaced the barn boards herself and driven her own cattle and kept her own accounts, and last week she had pulled a calf in the middle of the night without assistance, and both the calf and its mother had survived. She did not need anything from anyone. She especially did not need the complications that came with the kind of warm, sideways feeling that she had categorically decided she was not having about a man she barely knew. She was practical. She was capable. She was, above all else, determined to be the architect of her own life, because she had spent 4 years watching someone else be the architect while she lived in the building. These were true things, and she believed them, and she went out to check on the cattle. The following Saturday, Lydia rode into town to attend the small autumn social that the church women organized each year, not because she wanted to attend the social, but because Mrs. Henley had asked her specifically, and Mrs. Henley was a kind woman who had brought food to the house 3 times in the weeks after Robert's death without being asked, and without making a production of it, and Lydia had a policy about people who were quietly kind. The social was held in the church hall, which smelled of pine resin and coffee, and the particular combination of wool and determination that characterized women's gatherings in that part of the country. There were pies, and there was music from a fiddle player named Ed Marsh, who had only 3 songs but played them well, and there were approximately 30 people representing the surrounding ranches and the town families, and Lydia wore her good dress, the dark blue one with the cream collar, and her good boots, and she accepted a cup of coffee and stood near the window and watched the room with the kind of careful attention that had served her well for years. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes when she noticed that Jedediah Garrett had apparently accompanied his neighbor, old Pete Calloway, who was 63 and whose wife had died the previous spring, and who had the uncertain, rudderless quality of a man who did not know what to do with himself in social situations without a partner. Jedediah was standing next to Pete with his own cup of coffee, not talking much, but present in a way that seemed to be serving the purpose of keeping Pete from bolting for the door. Lydia thought, that is a kind thing. And then she thought, stop noticing things about him. She was having a conversation with Mrs. Henley about the prospects for winter wheat when Jedediah appeared at her elbow, not intrusively, not in the way that men appeared at elbows at social gatherings with an agenda attached. He simply moved into the general vicinity in a way that did not demand acknowledgement, and when she glanced at him he said, "Mrs. Walker," in a tone of simple greeting. "Mr. Garrett," she said. Mrs. Henley looked between them with the barely concealed delight of a woman who viewed social gatherings as opportunities for the organization of futures, and excused herself to refresh her coffee. Lydia watched her go and then looked at the room and said nothing, because she was not going to be the person who filled silences out of obligation. Jedediah did not fill the silence either. He stood beside her and drank his coffee and watched the room the way she was watching it, and after a period that Lydia estimated at 1 full minute, a genuinely remarkable amount of time for two people standing together to say nothing, he said, "You got the barn sorted." It was not a question. It was not a compliment in the pointed, patronizing way that men complimented women's work. It was an observation, the same way he had stated the fence breaks as observable fact. "I did," she said. "Good barn," he said. "It was my husband's barn," she said, and immediately felt the slight edge in her own voice, the small defensive note she had not entirely intended. He did not react to the edge. He did not smooth it over or pretend it wasn't there. He simply said, "I know, it's well built, I always thought so." There was a small pause. "He built it the second year," she said, and the edge was gone from her voice now, replaced by something more neutral and factual. "Before that the cattle were in a shelter that barely counted as a structure." "I remember the shelter," Jedediah said. "I rode past once in '72. I thought a strong wind would argue with it." "A moderate wind argued with it," Lydia said. "Regularly." Something moved across his face. It was the suggestion of a smile, not the full version, not the one she had seen briefly across the street when Buck Delaney had said something funny, but the earlier stage of it, the small lightening that came before. It was gone quickly, but she had seen it. She found that she was not entirely uncomfortable standing here. That was a complicated fact that she filed away for later examination. "Your cattle are back on your side of the fence," he said. "All 41 of them," she said. 42, he said. "That calf." She had actually forgotten the calf for a moment, and the count correction was delivered with such perfect matter-of-factness that she very nearly smiled herself. 42, she agreed. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He said, "Good evening, Mrs. Walker," and moved away to check on Pete Calloway, who had found his way to a corner and was regarding the pie table with the expression of a man who desperately wanted pie but was uncertain about the social mechanics of acquiring it. Lydia watched Jedediah steer Pete toward the pie table and then remained by the window drinking her own coffee and examining the specific quality of the feeling in her chest, which was unfamiliar and not entirely welcome, and which she was going to deal with by going home and sleeping and not thinking about it. She did not sleep well. The barn boards made their sound in the wind, and she lay in the dark in the honest part of her mind, the part she usually kept occupied with practical tasks, had nothing to do and went where it wanted. She thought about 4 years of a marriage that had been, by most measurable external standards, not a bad marriage. Robert had provided. Robert had worked hard. Robert had been faithful and relatively sober and not given to cruelty. He had also, without apparent awareness that it was a thing he was doing, systematically replaced every preference and opinion and small freedom that Lydia had arrived in the marriage with his own preferences and opinions and larger freedoms, not through force or anger, but through the steady, patient, impersonal certainty of someone who simply assumed that his way of seeing the world was the correct and complete way. Like a river remaking its banks, not violent, just constant. She had lost herself so gradually, she had not noticed the losing. And then he was gone, and she had stood in the open air of her own life, and the rebuilding was slow and daily and necessary, and she was doing it. She was not going to hand that rebuilding over to someone else. She was not going to trade one certainty for another, no matter how different the quality of the certainty appeared on the surface. She told herself this clearly in the dark, and believed it and turned over and eventually slept. October came in on a knife edge of cold that cut across the panhandle, and set everyone to serious autumn work. Lydia rode her fence lines daily, brought the cattle into the closer pastures, repaired a section of the creekside fence that had weakened, and worked on the accounts, which told her she had enough to get through the winter and into spring if she was careful, and if she did not have any extraordinary losses, which meant she needed to watch the herd through the cold months with particular attention. She also needed to find a buyer for 10 head of cattle before hard winter, because the numbers were tight, and the most reliable buyer in the area was a man named Cole Hutchins, who came out from Amarillo twice a year and dealt fairly with all the ranchers in the region without much favoritism. Lydia drove to Harlan's Creek to post a letter to Cole Hutchins' address in Amarillo, and on the way back she passed the turnoff to the Garrett property and did not slow down. 2 days later, returning from checking the east pasture, she found Jedediah Garrett's horse tied to her fence post near the gate. She pulled Clara to a stop and looked at the horse, a solid gray animal she had seen him ride in town, and then at the gate, which was open, and then down the track toward the barn. Jedediah was on the other side of the gate, on foot, not approaching the house. He was crouching near the gate post with a level and a measuring instrument, doing what appeared to be an assessment of the gate hardware, which had been giving Lydia trouble for 2 weeks. The latch had a habit of not catching, which meant the gate required a particular deliberate push to close properly, and twice she had come out in the morning to find it swinging open. He was not at the house. He was not in the barn. He was at the gate, which was a problem she had mentioned to no one, which meant he had noticed it himself. She walked Clara up to the gate and stopped. "You could have knocked," she said. He looked up. "You were not here," he said. "I was going to go up to the house after." "What are you doing?" she asked, and the question was direct and slightly cool, and she did not soften it. "The hinge bolt is stripped," he said. "It is why the latch will not hold. A stripped hinge bolt puts the door out of true by about a 1/4 inch, and the latch post does not line up." He looked at her steadily. "I have a matching bolt in my toolbox. I can replace it in 10 minutes, or I can leave it and you can replace it when you get the part." Lydia looked at the gate. She had been fighting with that gate for 2 weeks and had assigned the problem to the latch itself, which she had adjusted 3 times without improvement. A stripped hinge bolt. She had not looked at the hinge bolt. "You were at the gate with a level," she said. "You were checking the alignment." "Yes," he said. "Why?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not a hostile one. He seemed to consider this. "I noticed it when I rode past last week," he said. "You came out of the gate and it swung back and you had to push it twice to get it to catch. I thought the hinge looked low on the right side." "So you rode over with a level," she said. "I was going past anyway," he said. He stood up. He was a full head taller than she was, which she registered as a fact and not a threat. "I can leave the bolt on the post and you can put it in yourself if you prefer." He said this without any particular meaning loaded into it. He was not being sarcastic. He was not making a point. He was offering an entirely genuine alternative, as if either outcome was acceptable to him. She looked at him for a long moment. He waited. He was very good at waiting. "Replace it," she said, "and I will be watching how it is done." Something that was almost entirely not a smile moved across his face. "All right," he said. She dismounted and stood beside the gate, and he showed her the stripped bolt and demonstrated the way it had allowed the upper hinge to sag, and he replaced the bolt with the one from his toolbox, and she watched every step, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted to know how it was done. When he was finished, the gate swung clean and latched on the first push with a satisfying click. "There," he said. "I could have done that," she said. "Yes," he said. "You would have figured it out when you got to the bolt." "It would have taken me longer," she said, and this was an honest concession, not a capitulation. "Most things do the first time," he said, not to her specifically. Just in general. She looked at the gate. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." "Jedediah," he said, and then paused as if he had surprised himself slightly by saying it. She considered this. "Lydia," she said. He nodded. He picked up his toolbox, went to his horse, remounted with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and said, "Good afternoon," and rode back the way he had come. Lydia pushed the gate open and closed it again twice just to feel it work properly. Then she led Clara through it and went to see to the horses. She told Mrs. Henley about the gate bolt the following Sunday after church, not the whole story, but the part about the stripped hinge being the source of the problem, and Mrs. Henley listened and nodded and said, "Jedediah Garrett is a careful observer," with a tone of voice that Lydia declined to acknowledge. "He is a useful neighbor," Lydia said, and changed the subject. November arrived. The cold settled in properly, the kind that came with a gray sky and a wind that found every gap in your clothing and your thinking. Lydia had a routine now, the rhythm of the ranch days, early mornings and late evenings, and the physical work in between that she had come to find deeply satisfying in a way that domestic work had never quite managed, because the results of ranch work were always legible. You mended a fence, and the fence was mended. You pulled a calf, and the calf was alive. The books were honest, and the land did not tell you one thing and mean another. Cole Hutchins came through in the third week of October as expected, and Lydia sold him 12 head of cattle at a fair price, better than she had anticipated, which put the winter accounts in a considerably easier position. She drove back from the sale with the cash in her coat pocket and a feeling of such clean, uncomplicated satisfaction that she stopped the wagon at the crest of the small hill above her land and looked at the 312 acres spread out below her in the autumn light, the amber grass and the dark line of the creek and the barn and the house, and she thought, mine, not inherited, not managed, not overseen by anyone else. Hers. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats, and turned to find Jedediah coming up the hill on the gray horse, heading home by way of the main road that passed the overlook. He pulled up when he saw her because stopping was the polite thing to do, and he was, whatever else he was, consistently polite. "Cattle sale go well?" he asked. "Better than expected," she said. "Hutchins plays fair," he said. "He does," she agreed. She paused. "Did you sell this trip?" "8 head," he said. "I am holding the rest through spring." She turned back to look at her land. He did not leave. He looked at the land with her, and there was a companionable quality to the silence that she had noticed was specific to him. Other people's silences wanted things from her, wanted her to fill them or acknowledge them or perform comfort in them. His silences just were. They existed the way the land existed without demanding anything. "It is a good piece of land," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are running it well," he said, and it was not flattery. It was the same register as everything else he said, observed fact. She looked at him. The late afternoon light was doing something in particular to the sky behind him, that specific deepening of western light in late autumn that turned everything amber and bronze. And he sat on his horse in it with his hat casting a shadow across the upper half of his face and his gray eyes looking at her with that direct, undemanding attention. And she had the sudden, unsteady sensation of the ground being less certain than it had been a moment before. "What are you thinking?" she asked, and she had not planned to say it. It came out of somewhere more honest than the level of conversation they had been maintaining. He took his time answering. "I am thinking that you are the most determined person I have encountered in approximately 8 years of this country," he said, "and that this land is lucky to have you on it." Lydia looked at him for a long time. "That is not fixing me," she said. He looked puzzled, not by the words themselves, she thought, but by the specific significance she was assigning to them. "No," he said, "it is not." "Good," she said, and clucked to Clara and rode back down the hill to her land. She lay awake that night for a different reason than the usual practical inventory of tasks. She lay awake because she was 26 years old and she had not been lonely until approximately now, and the loneliness was specific in a way that made it worse, which was that it was not the general loneliness of a widow or the loneliness of a person without community. It was the precise, uncomfortable loneliness of having stood next to a particular person at a social gathering and found the standing unexpectedly easy, and of having watched him replace a bolt and listened to him explain the alignment problem with the patience of someone who was not performing helpfulness but simply being it. and of having sat beside him on a hill looking at her land and heard him say she was the most determined person he had encountered, and she knew he meant it because he did not appear to be capable of saying things he did not mean. She had told herself she would only trust a man who did not try to fix her. She had not quite articulated this in those exact terms, but it had been the operating condition of her post-Robert life, the test she had set without quite naming it. Every man in Harlan's Creek who had appeared at her gate in the weeks after Robert's death with advice and condolence and suggestions and well-meaning certainty about what a widow ought to do had failed this test immediately. The advice was the tell. The fixing was the tell. The assumption that she was a problem to be solved. Jedediah Garrett had fixed her fence and replaced her bolt and said she was determined and had ridden away, and at no point had he attempted to fix her. He had fixed the things that needed fixing and left her entirely alone to be exactly who she was. She did not know what to do with this. In the morning she got up and fed the horses and checked the cattle and repaired a section of the creek side fence that she had noted yesterday and did not, absolutely did not, think about gray eyes or the specific warmth of a voice stating simple observations in the amber light of a late autumn afternoon. She managed this for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, she baked 2 pies. She was an excellent baker. This had survived Robert's tenure as the chief of her preferences intact, and she put one in a cloth-covered basket and rode over to the Garrett property on Clara because she was not a person who ignored debts, and Jedediah had replaced her hinge bolt, and the gate had worked properly for 3 weeks now, and she had been meaning to do something about that debt, and a pie was a sensible and appropriate acknowledgement. This was entirely practical. She was perfectly clear about this. The Garrett property was tidier than she had expected, though she did not know why she had expected anything different. The house was small and well-kept log construction with a deep porch that faced south to catch the winter sun, and there was a woodpile that reached the porch eaves and was stacked with what she recognized as unusual care, the pieces fitted together with an almost architectural precision. There were 2 dogs, a black one and a spotted one, who came out from under the porch and regarded her with friendly curiosity. Jedediah came out of the barn when she rode in. He was carrying a length of chain and had a smear of grease on one forearm, and he stopped when he saw her with an expression that was purely attentive and without the particular wariness she had seen in her own face in the mirror for most of the past year. "I made pie," she said, holding up the basket, "for the bolt." "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." He looked at the basket. He looked at her. "Come in and have coffee," he said. And then, immediately, as if he had heard himself and wanted to be certain she understood the nature of the invitation, "If you want. The coffee is ready. I was about to stop for it anyway." She considered the invitation. She considered the easy quality of it, the absence of pressure. "All right," she said. She tied Clara to the hitching post and followed him onto the porch and through the door into a house that was immediately and specifically interesting. It was a spare house, the way she would have expected, but the sparseness was not the sparseness of a man who did not care about his surroundings. There was a bookshelf with a meaningful number of books, more than she had expected, and she made a mental note of the titles visible on the spines. There was a table that was clean and had a good quality of wood. There was a window seat with a faded cushion that had clearly been made by someone's hands a long time ago, and there was, on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a small carved wooden bird that was so precisely rendered it looked as though it might lift off the shelf of its own accord. She went to the mantelpiece while he poured the coffee and looked at the bird. "Who made this?" she asked. "I did," he said, with the same flat evenness he applied to most statements about himself. She turned and looked at him. "When?" "Winters mostly, when there is not much else to do with the hands." He set the coffee cups on the table. "It passes the time." "It is extraordinary," she said, and meant it. He sat down and she sat across from him, and they drank coffee at his table, and she discovered that the specific ease she had noticed in his presence in public was not diminished in a private setting, which was somewhat against her experience of how men generally operated. Men who were restrained in public frequently became something different in private. Jedediah was simply the same, the steady, attentive quality unchanged by setting. They talked. Not about significant things, at first, about the cattle, about the coming winter, about Cole Hutchins' plans for the spring drive, about whether the creek was likely to flood again if the spring rains were heavy. And then, moving gradually and without any particular urgency, about other things. About where he had come from Kentucky originally, which explained the slight softness in certain vowels that she had noticed and filed away. About the cattle drives, which he described with a dry wit that made her laugh twice, which surprised her because she had not laughed easily in some time. About her. Not in the way she feared. Not in the way that meant someone preparing to have opinions about her circumstances. He asked carefully how long she had been in Texas, and she said 8 years, and he asked how she had ended up in the panhandle specifically, and she told him the shape of the thing following Robert's decision, the land purchase, the move, and he listened to the way she told it without apparently listening for anything in particular, but she thought he heard more than the words. She had the sense, talking to him, of being seen without being examined. "Do you like it?" he asked. "The panhandle. Do you like it specifically, or is it just where you are?" The question sat her back slightly. No one had asked her that. Robert had never asked her that. The women in town had asked how she was managing, how she was holding up, whether she was getting enough sleep and eating enough, and had she thought about whether she might go back to family. No one had asked whether she liked the place. "I like it," she said, and felt the truth of it as she said it. "I like how big the sky is. I like that you can see weather coming from a long way off. I like that the land makes honest demands. It will not pretend to be easier than it is." He nodded. "Yes," he said, simply. As though she had said something that he recognized completely. She walked home in the long winter dusk, and her heart was doing something she had not asked it to do, and she was going to have to address this. December was cold and bright and full of work that she could not have done without the particular combination of stubbornness and physical capability she had spent the last 6 months developing. She had a stove that required stoking through the night on the coldest nights, which meant sleeping in cycles, and cattle that needed checking at dawn, and a water trough near the barn that froze hard most mornings and had to be broken before the animals could drink. She had meals to cook and accounts to keep, and a small aching loneliness that she managed by filling every available hour with task. She and Jedediah had fallen into a pattern that had not been discussed or decided, but simply developed the way rivers develop their courses, following the path of least resistance while still arriving somewhere definite. He rode past her property most days in the course of his own work, and sometimes he stopped, and they talked through the fence or the gate about practical things. The weather, the herd conditions, the state of the road into town. He never lingered past the point where the conversation had reached a natural conclusion. He never manufactured reasons to stay. When he was there, he was entirely present. When he left cleanly, and she found this, increasingly, something she thought about. She thought about it in the way that she thought about everything she was uncertain about, by working through it methodically from the outside in. The evidence was, she was comfortable with him in a way she was not comfortable with most people. The evidence was, she looked for him when she rode the fence line, and when she saw his horse moving on the far side of his property, she felt something settle in her that had been unsteady. The evidence was, she remembered specific things he had said, not because they were remarkable things, but because they were his. She did not want to need him. That was the linchpin. She did not want to need him the way she had needed Robert, which was to say, in the structural, trapped way of a woman whose life had been organized around a man before she had fully organized it around herself. She was not finished building the thing that was her own. She was not certain you were ever finished. On a Saturday in mid-December, he rode over in the early afternoon with his hat pulled down against the wind and knocked at her door and stood on the porch with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a person who is about to say something they have been working up to. "I want to tell you something." he said. She stepped back and let him in, because the cold off the porch was significant. He stood in her kitchen and held his hat in both hands and looked at her, and she waited because that was what she did with him, waited, because he was always going to arrive at the thing he meant. I like talking to you, he said. I want to be straight about it because I think you prefer things to be straight, and because I think you have probably had enough of people circling around what they actually mean. He paused. I'm not assuming anything. I know your situation and I know that you have been running this place on your own terms and I respect that absolutely. But I wanted to say it clearly so you knew and so you could do with it what you chose. Lydia looked at him for a long time. I like talking to you too, she said. Something in him shifted, a barely perceptible easing of some tension she had not known was there. All right, he said. That is all it is, she said. Right now, that is all it is. All right, he said again with the same equanimity. He was not diminished by the limitation. He was simply accepting of it. She looked at him in her kitchen, holding his hat, having said the direct and honest thing and having accepted the direct and honest answer with neither wounded pride nor strategic retreat. She thought, this is different. This is specifically, meaningfully different from everything I know about this transaction. Stay for supper, she said. I have a stew on. He stayed for supper, and they talked about Kentucky and Texas and the nature of the cattle business and a book on her shelf that he had read the previous winter. And the conversation moved the way good conversations move, without effort and without performance. And when he left in the early dark, he said good night and rode home across the cold land, and Lydia closed the door and stood in her warm kitchen and pressed one hand flat against the table and held on to the honesty of her own feelings long enough to look at them. She was falling in love with Jedediah Garrett. She was doing it carefully and slowly and with full awareness, the way you cross uncertain ice, but she was doing it. The ground was shifting under her, and unlike the last time she had stood on shifting ground, she did not feel as though she was losing anything. She felt as though she was gaining something she had not known was missing. Christmas came and went quietly. She spent it with Mrs. Henley and the Henley family, a warm and crowded supper that reminded her of the possibility of abundance, and she walked home in the cold starlight thinking about the specific quality of fullness she wanted her life to have. January brought the hardest cold of the year, the kind that freezes the water in the pitcher on the bedside table and makes the horses stand close together with their heads down. Lydia kept the stove running and the cattle alive and herself occupied, and when the cold cracked slightly in the second week of January, and a day arrived that was merely cold rather than brutal, she rode the full fence line for the first time in 2 weeks, and found 2 down posts on the south side that the frozen ground had heaved up. She was assessing the damage, her breath coming in visible clouds, when she heard hoofbeats and turned to find Jedediah pulling up on the gray horse, bundled against the cold in a heavy coat. South side, he asked. 2 posts, she said. The ground heaved them. Same on my east side, he said. He looked at the posts. Ground is hard. The post-hole digger will barely touch it, she said. I have a bar, he said. Iron for breaking frozen ground, I could bring it. She looked at the posts. She looked at him. Bring it, she said. He went and came back in 20 minutes with the iron bar, and they worked the 2 posts back into the ground together. She with the post-hole digger and the hammer, and he with the iron bar breaking the frozen earth ahead of her tool. And they worked without talking much because the cold did not encourage long conversations. But they moved well together, anticipating each other's next movements in the way of people who have been paying close attention to each other for some time. When the second post was in and tamped and she stood back to look at the fence line, straight and solid again, she realized that she was cold through every layer, but something inside the cold was warm, and the warm thing was being here, specifically here, doing this specific work, next to this specific person. Jedediah, she said. He turned and looked at her. I am going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to hear it as a straightforward question and not as anything more complicated than it is. All right, he said. "Do you want to have supper with me on Sunday?" she asked. "Not because there is work to do, not because I owe you anything for the posts. Just supper as a thing we do because we want to." He looked at her. The cold air was between them, their breath mingling in small clouds. "Yes," he said, "I want that." "Sunday," she said, "come at 5. He came at 5. He brought a bottle of good whiskey, which she put on the shelf, and she made a roast chicken with root vegetables that she was quietly proud of. And they sat at her table and ate and talked, and the conversation had a different quality now, warmer and less careful, as though the particular framework of mutual wariness they had both been maintaining had been acknowledged and set aside by common consent. He told her about his father, who had been a Methodist preacher in Kentucky with large hands and a larger voice and very firm opinions about the geography of salvation. She heard in the telling the shape of a man who had grown up with certainty pressing on him from one direction and had developed his own brand of careful spaciousness in response. She said this, not exactly in those words, and he went quiet for a moment and then said, "Yes, that is exactly right," with the particular note of being recognized that she understood because she felt it herself, in his company. She told him about her mother, who had been a practical woman in the best sense of the word, who had run a household with precision and warmth, and who had died of fever when Lydia was 15, and how the loss of her had left a particular gap in the architecture of Lydia's understanding of what a woman's life could look like. Her mother had been the first person who had ever seemed to move through the world on her own terms, and without that model, she had navigated young womanhood and early marriage with less equipment than she had needed. He listened to all of this. He did not offer solutions. He did not say what he would have done differently or what he thought she ought to feel about it. He listened with the full quality of his attention, and when she finished he said, "She sounds like someone worth missing," and the simplicity of it landed in exactly the right place. They finished the whiskey on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in their coats, looking at the winter sky which was blazing with stars the way the panhandle sky only did in the depths of winter, when the air was so cold and clear it had no choice but to be perfectly transparent. "I am not going to rush this," she said to the stars. "I need you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I have things I am still building," she said, "and I need them to be mine, all the way mine the whole time." "Yes," he said. Not reassuringly, not as comfort, as understanding. She turned and looked at him, his profile against the starry dark, and she thought about what it meant to trust someone. Not the romantic version of trust, the one that came with promises and rings and legal documents. The prior version. The version that said, "I believe you are who you appear to be. I believe your intentions toward me are clear and clean. I believe that you will not, over time, replace the furniture of my life with your own preferences while I stand by and not notice." She could not be certain. No one could be certain. But she was better at reading people than she had been 4 years ago, and what she read in him was consistent. A man who was who he was, without performance, who asked for what he wanted directly and accepted what was given without negotiating upward, who was interested in her specifically, in the actual Lydia Walker who fixed fences and ran accounts and pulled calves in the middle of the night and baked excellent pies, not in the useful widow with the 300 acres, not in the abstract idea of a woman to make a ranch complete. February came, and with it a thaw that turned the roads to mud and the creek to a loud, brown rush of snowmelt from the north. Lydia had 3 calves in February, which was early and kept her up several nights, and on the third of those nights she knocked on no one's door and asked for no one's help because she did not need it. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, with the second calf delivered, and the third one coming in a complicated presentation, she allowed herself to think about how much she would have liked him there, just for the company, just for the quiet of another person she trusted in the dark of the barn. She delivered the third calf successfully. In the morning she slept for 4 hours and then rode over to tell him, because they had been telling each other things. He came out of his house when he heard her and she told him about the 3 calves and the difficult third one, and he listened and asked the right questions about the positioning and the outcome, and then he said, "You should be proud of that," and she said, "I am." And she meant both the calf and the general fact of herself, and he understood both. He put his hand on her arm just briefly through the coat. It was the first time he had touched her. It lasted exactly as long as it meant to, and then it was over, and they stood in his yard in the February thaw looking at each other, and Lydia felt the specific warmth of it traveling up her arm and into her chest like a coal set in exactly the right spot. "I think," she said, "that I am going to want to kiss you at some point." He looked at her. His gray eyes were doing the thing she had come to recognize, where they became very still and very focused, and she had cataloged enough of his reactions to know that this one meant he was feeling something significant and organizing it carefully. "I can wait," he said, "for whenever that is." "It is not right now," she said. "But I am telling you so you know." "I know," he said, and the warmth in his voice was the warmest thing she had heard in a very long time. March arrived with mud and new grass, and a particular quality of sky that was different from winter sky, lighter and more uncertain, full of possibility and weather both. Lydia had survived her first full winter on the ranch alone, which meant she had done the thing she had set out to do, and the accomplishment of it had a completeness that she stood inside like a room she had built herself. She and Jedediah had been having Sunday suppers regularly since January, alternating between her house and his, and the ease of being together had deepened in a way that was slow and steady, and therefore entirely trustworthy. They had argued twice, once about the best approach to managing the creek flooding in spring, a dispute in which they were both partly right and neither of them retreated from their position, until they had examined it from every angle, and which ended with a solution that was genuinely better than either of their original positions. And once about a question of judgment regarding a situation in town that she did not feel was her business and he felt was a community matter. And she had said so directly, and he had disagreed, and they had each held their position and then sat in companionable silence and drunk their coffee, and it had not damaged anything between them. In April, on a Sunday when the evening was warm enough to eat outside on the porch, he asked her something. "What would you want?" he said. "If you were thinking about the future, what does it look like?" She thought about it seriously because it was a serious question. "This ranch running well," she said. "Full pastures and healthy cattle and the accounts in the black. A house that is mine with a kitchen I like and room for books." She paused. "Company," she said. "The right kind." "The right kind," he said. "Someone who does not need me to be less than I am," she said. "Someone who sees all of it and is not alarmed by it." He looked at her with those direct gray eyes. "I am not alarmed by any of it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am sitting here." She kissed him then. She had decided she was ready, and when she decided something, she was thorough about it. She leaned across the small distance between their 2 chairs on the porch and kissed him, and he was very still for one moment, and then kissed her back with a gentleness that was not hesitance but care, the same quality of care he applied to everything he did, and she put her hand against his jaw and felt the roughness of it and the warmth underneath and thought, "Yes, this." When she pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, unguarded and entirely sincere and considerably more complicated than his usual calm. "Lydia," he said, "just her name." "I know," she said. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, and the conversation that followed was quiet and warm and entirely honest, the way conversations between people who have stopped performing for each other become. May brought the ranch into full spring operations. Branding, checking the expanded herd, the long days and the smell of new grass, and the particular beauty of the panhandle in spring that always surprised her, the way beauty in a hard place always surprises. She had 48 head now, the winter calves having all survived, and the spring calves beginning to arrive, and the accounts were solid, and she was capable and happy and in love with the man on the adjacent property who had never once, in 8 months of knowing her, suggested that she was anything other than exactly what she needed to be. She had decided she wanted to marry him. She had reached this decision by the same methodical, evidence-based process she applied to all significant ranch decisions, and having reached it, she saw no reason to wait for him to arrive at it separately when she could simply tell him. She rode over on a Tuesday evening in late May. He was on the porch in the last of the daylight with a piece of wood in his hands and a small knife, working on something she could not yet identify. He looked up when she rode in. "I want to marry you," she said, from the saddle. He went still. He looked at her. He looked at the wood in his hands. He set the wood and knife down on the porch rail with particular care. "Come down off that horse," he said, and his voice had a quality she did not usually hear in it, low and rough at the edges. She dismounted and tied Clara and came up the steps, and he was standing at the top of them, and he took both her hands in both of his and looked at her with the most direct and present thing she had ever seen in his face, all the careful containment gone, and he said, "Yes, there is nothing in this world I want more than that." She breathed in. She breathed out. She felt the ground under her, solid and real and entirely her own. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me," he said. "The Walker land stays in my name," she said. "We work both properties, but the Walker land is mine, my name, my deed." "Obviously," he said without a moment's hesitation. "I run my own accounts," she said. "I would not want it any other way," he said. "You run your accounts better than I run mine." Something in her loosened. "I make my own decisions about my cattle and my land," she said. "We can consult, we can disagree, but the final word on Walker land operations is mine." "Yes," he said. "And if you ever," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and she looked at him straight, "if you ever begin to make my decisions for me, or replace what I think with what you think, or make me smaller than I am because it is more convenient, Lydia," he said, "I need to say it. Say it." "I will leave," she said. "I would rather be alone and whole than together and lost." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "I know that about you," he said. "I knew it before you said it. It is one of the things I love about you." Her eyes stung unexpectedly, and she blinked once. "All right," she said. He raised her hands and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, the left hand and then the right, and when he looked up at her there was everything that needed to be said in his eyes, clear as the winter sky. They married in June. It was a small wedding, which was what they both wanted, the church in Harlan's Creek, which smelled of pine and was full of morning light, with Mrs. Henley and her family and Pete Calloway and Buck Delaney, and a few of the other ranchers they were genuinely fond of, and Ed Marsh playing his 3 songs on the fiddle, one of which happened to be appropriate for a wedding. Lydia wore the dark blue dress with the cream collar and had flowers from Mrs. Henley's garden pinned in her hair, and she walked down the aisle of that small church under her own power, not on anyone's arm, and stood before the preacher with Jedediah beside her, and felt the full weight and clarity of her own choice. He looked at her in that moment, just looked at her, without ceremony or performance, and she thought, "This man has sat beside me and fixed fences and replaced bolts and worked frozen ground alongside me and eaten at my table and listened to everything I said and never once tried to change what I was." And she thought, "This is what trust feels like when it is earned by behavior rather than promised in words." The preacher said the words. They said their own. When the preacher said Jedediah could kiss his bride, Jedediah turned to her and she leaned up to him, and the kiss was the same as the first one, careful and warm and honest. And the small congregation made the sound of people who are genuinely happy for 2 people, which was a different sound than applause. They went home to the Walker property. They had agreed on this. The Walker house was larger and would be enlarged further in time, and the Garrett house would be kept and used, and they cooked supper together that evening, moving around the kitchen in the easy way of people who have already learned each other's rhythms. And they ate at Lydia's table in Lydia's kitchen with the window that looked east toward the creek, and it was the most ordinary and perfect evening she could remember. Summer was full and warm, and the ranch work was plentiful, and they worked it together in the way she had imagined, each making decisions within their own domain, consulting when it was useful, disagreeing when they disagreed and working through it honestly, and never, not once, did she feel the particular suffocating pressure of someone else's certainty replacing her own. He was not, she had come to understand, a person who had certainty about other people. He had patience. He had attention. He had opinions, which he expressed when asked and withheld when not, and which he was genuinely willing to revise in the face of contrary evidence. He was the opposite of a wall. He was, she thought, something more like weather present and undeniable and changing and entirely itself. In late August she told him she was pregnant. They were at the table after supper, accounts spread between them, his accounts and hers, side by side but separate as they always were, and she looked at the column of numbers and then looked up at him and said, "I think we are going to need to think about the spring. I think there will be something else to consider." He looked up from his figures. He looked at her face. He read it the way he read everything, completely and without projection. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. He set his pencil down and looked at her with that unguarded quality she had come to love in him, the thing that appeared when something mattered deeply, all the careful containment dissolved. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Perfectly fine, a little tired." "Good fine or concerning fine?" he asked, because he knew her well enough to ask that specific question. "Good fine," she said. "I know the difference." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, not a difficult quiet, just the quality of a person holding something significant. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "About the spring operations, about the house. Tell me what you need." And there it was, tell me what you need. Not here is what we will do, not here is what you must do, tell me what you need. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I need it to be mine," she said. "This too, the same way everything else is mine." "It is yours," he said. His hand turned under hers and held it. "All of it, I am here, but it is yours." The pregnancy was easy, as these things went in 1878, and she was relentlessly practical about it. She did not stop working until working became genuinely unwise. She ate well and rested when she needed to and saw the doctor in Harlan's Creek twice. And she kept her accounts and ran her herd. And on a cold, clear morning in late April of 1879, she delivered a boy at home, attended by Mrs. Henley, who had more experience with this than anyone, and by Jedediah, who she had asked to be there not because she needed him but because she wanted him. He was present throughout in the way she had come to know him, completely, quietly, doing exactly what was asked of him and no more. When it was over and Mrs. Henley placed the baby in her arms, Lydia looked down at the wrinkled, furious, entirely alive face of her son and felt the kind of love that was different from all other loves, the kind that arrived complete and non-negotiable like a weather event. "Well," she said to the baby, "here you are." Jedediah was beside her, close but not crowding, and when she looked up at him his face was doing everything at once, and she had never loved him more than at this moment of watching him see their son for the first time. He was trying to be quiet about it and failing, and she did not say anything about the failing, she just let it be. "Here he is," Jedediah said. "His name," she said. "I have been thinking about his name." "Whatever you want," he said. "I was thinking Thomas," she said, "after my father," his face. "Yes," he said, "Thomas." Thomas Walker Garrett came into the world in the spring of 1879, and the world he came into was a good one. The ranch was doing well. Both the Walker land and the Garrett land, now essentially operated as one large concern while remaining legally separate, because that was how it was going to be, and everyone who dealt with them understood this clearly. Lydia ran the Walker accounts and Jedediah ran the Garrett accounts, and they compared notes regularly and made combined decisions about the herd and the land with the efficiency of people who had learned each other's thinking well enough to be genuinely useful to each other. Thomas grew through his first year with the healthy stubbornness of a child raised on good land and surrounded by people who paid attention. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's jaw, which Jedediah said when he first noticed it, and Lydia said, "That is the most tactful thing you have ever said." And he laughed, which was one of her favorite things about him. The way his laugh was specific and real and not performed for anyone's benefit. Harlan's Creek had begun to change, slowly, the way all frontier towns in that period were beginning to change. The railroad was building west in fits and starts, and there was talk. There was always talk about a spur line coming through the region, which would change the cattle business considerably, which would mean different decisions about herd sizes and drive routes. Lydia attended the meeting at the church hall where the Amarillo land agent came and gave a presentation about the railroad's plans, and she sat in the front row with her own notebook and wrote down everything that was relevant. And when the questions came, she asked 3 of them in clear, direct language that sent a small ripple through the room. Because in 1878, 1879, women who asked direct questions in public meetings were noted. And the land agent answered her questions honestly because she had made them impossible to evade. Jedediah sat beside her in that meeting and said nothing and let her do everything she was doing, and on the ride home he said, "That was well done," and she said, "The second question was the important one," and he said, "Yes, I thought so too," and they talked through the implications for the ranch for the rest of the ride home. The second pregnancy was confirmed in the spring of 1880, which Lydia received with the same practical equanimity she applied to most significant developments, and which Jedediah received by making sure the crib in the corner of the bedroom was in good repair and asking her, weekly, what she needed. She needed very little and said so, and he provided it without amendment. In December of 1880, on a night when the stars were doing their winter blazing and the cold had settled hard across the panhandle, Lydia delivered a daughter. She had known or suspected, and she had not mentioned this certainty to Jedediah because she wanted to see his face when it was confirmed. His face was everything she had hoped it would be. "Clara," Lydia said, "after the mare. After the horse that had carried her through her first year alone and never once failed her." "Clara," Jedediah said, looking at the small girl in his wife's arms. "That is exactly right." Thomas, 18 months old and deeply suspicious of the general situation, regarded his sister from the doorway of the bedroom with the expression of a person who had not been adequately consulted about a significant change in his circumstances. Lydia looked at him over the baby's head and said, "Come here, Thomas," and he came to her with the beginning of a wobble in his lower lip, and she made room for him beside her on the bed, and he looked at Clara with the gravity of a child attempting to understand something too large for his current vocabulary. "Baby," he said. "Your sister," Lydia said. He considered this. He reached out one cautious finger, and Clara, with the total indifference of the newborn, ignored him entirely. He looked at Lydia. He looked at Jedediah, who was watching both children with an expression of such pure, helpless love that Lydia tucked it away in the part of her mind that kept the things she wanted to always have access to. "My sister," Thomas said, with the proprietary air of someone who had decided to accept a situation and make the best of it. "Yes," Lydia said, "your sister." The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, with work and weather and the changing of seasons and the growth of children, and the deepening of a love that had been built slowly and honestly, and therefore had no hollow places in it. Lydia Walker Garrett, she had added his name while keeping her own, because there was enough room in a name for both, because that was what she wanted, and it had been her choice, ran her land and her accounts, and made her decisions, and consulted her husband when it was useful and disagreed with him when she disagreed. And the thing she had feared most, the slow replacement of herself, the gradual filling in of her own architecture with someone else's preferences, never came. It never came because he was not that kind of man, and she had known that since the morning he had ridden along her broken fence line and fixed his section, and left hers for her to fix and ridden away without saying anything that needed saying. Thomas at 5 was serious and observant, and already showing the quality of stillness that was his father's most distinctive feature, combined with his mother's absolute conviction that if something needed doing you simply did it until it was done. Clara at 3 was loud and specific in her opinions and had been since approximately the first week of her life, and Lydia looked at her daughter's particular brand of certainty and thought, let her keep it. Let no one sand that down. She had said this to Jedediah one evening, watching Clara conduct a lengthy and passionate argument with a fence post about whether the fence post was in the right place. She will keep it, Jedediah said. Look at her mother. Lydia had looked at her husband then, the way you look at someone you have learned over time, the way you look at something that has become part of the landscape of your daily life without becoming invisible, because it is too specifically itself to ever become invisible. She looked at the gray eyes that had never once looked at her in the calculating way, at the hands that had fixed fences and replaced bolts and helped deliver calves, and held her hands at a small church altar, and carved a bird that sat on the mantelpiece as though preparing for flight. At the particular quality of stillness that was not the stillness of a wall but the stillness of deep water. I love you, she said, which she said regularly, because she had decided she was going to be the kind of person who said the important things directly and often. I love you, he said, and it was the same thing it had always been from him, true and unadorned and entirely real. In the summer of 1882, a third child arrived. Another boy, whom they named Samuel, after the preacher who had married them, because the preacher had died the previous winter and had been a genuinely good man, and Lydia had liked him without reservation, which was the highest category in her esteem. Samuel was round and cheerful from the beginning, the easiest of the three, and Thomas took to him immediately with the air of an experienced older sibling, while Clara tolerated him with the graciousness of someone who has decided that a new household member is permissible as long as her own status remains unambiguous. The ranch grew. Lydia bought the 40 acres to the south of the Walker land when old Jim Pickett sold up and moved to live with his daughter in Missouri, which expanded the Walker holding considerably, and gave them a second creek access point that improved the summer grazing situation meaningfully. She negotiated the purchase herself, drove to Pickett's place with the lawyer from Harlan's Creek and conducted the transaction, and came home with the deed and set it on the table in front of Jedediah, and he looked at it and looked at her with the expression she loved best on him. You got it at a fair price, he said. I got it at a good price, she said. A good price, he agreed, and the pride in his voice was the simple, uncompetitive pride of someone who is genuinely pleased by another person's accomplishment. The railroad did come through, eventually, in 1885, a spur line that passed 15 miles south of Harlan's Creek and changed the cattle business exactly as Lydia had anticipated at that meeting in the church hall 6 years earlier. She had positioned the Walker operation well for it, a smaller, higher quality herd with better pasture management, and they transitioned to the new system with less disruption than most of the ranchers in the area. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the accounts were done and the day's work was finished, she and Jedediah sat on the south-facing porch of the Walker house, which had been expanded in 1881 to include a proper parlor and a larger kitchen that Lydia was extremely pleased with, and they watched the Texas night arrive across their land. The sky did the thing it did in the panhandle, going from gold to deep orange to a purple so dark it was almost black, and the stars came out one by one and then all at once. They talked about the children and the cattle and the accounts and things they had read and things they were planning and things that were happening in the wider world, which was changing fast in ways that were sometimes alarming and sometimes full of promise. They talked about the injustices they saw in the territory, the way that the Comanche bands had been pushed onto reservations in conditions that were cruel and unjust, the systematic reduction of a people, and a way of life that had existed on this land long before any of them had arrived, and which Lydia refused to pretend she did not see, because she had been raised by a practical mother who believed that looking at things clearly was the foundation of any moral position. Jedediah agreed, and the agreement was not the easy social agreement of someone nodding along. He had thought about it himself, had his own clear-eyed accounting of what the settlement of the panhandle had cost those who had been here first, and they had this conversation seriously and returned to it regularly because serious things deserved regular consideration. They disagreed sometimes about practical matters and occasionally about larger ones, and neither of them was diminished by the disagreement, and sometimes one of them changed their mind, and sometimes neither of them did, and the marriage held because it was built on something more durable than agreement. It was built on the genuine belief, held by each of them, that the other person was fully a person, with the complete rights and responsibilities that entailed. Thomas grew into a boy who was going to be a rancher. It was already clear. He had the instinct for it, the land sense, the ability to read weather and cattle and the quality of grass that some people simply had. Clara grew into a girl who was going to be whatever she decided to be, and Lydia worked every day to make sure the world around her daughter did as little as possible to constrain that. Samuel was 5 years old and interested primarily in dogs and the question of what was on the other side of every hill, which Lydia found both reasonable and charming. On an afternoon in the late summer of 1883, Lydia walked the fence line of the Walker land, all of it, the full perimeter, which she still did regularly, every season, because it was her land and she knew every post and every wire length of it. And when she reached the northern boundary, the original fence line that divided Walker land from Garrett land, she stopped and put her hand on the top wire and stood in the late afternoon heat and thought about the morning 5 years ago when this fence had lain in 3 broken pieces, and she had been standing here with sore hands and a wire-cut glove and a jaw set against the world. She heard hoofbeats. She turned. Jedediah came along the fence line on the gray horse's successor. The gray horse had died 2 years past and had been mourned by both of them. A strong roan he had been working for 3 years, and pulled up near her with the easy familiarity of a man arriving at a place he knew well. "Checking the line," he said. "Annual," she said. He dismounted and stood beside her, looking along the fence. The posts she had replaced that first morning 5 years ago were still solid. The wire was taut. The fence was in good condition. "Do you remember," she said. "Which part?" he said. "The first day," she said. "The fence was down in 3 places and you rode along to your section and fixed it and didn't say anything about mine." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember," he said. "I was so angry that day," she said. "Not at you specifically, just at everything." "I know," he said. "And you didn't try to fix that," she said. "Just the fence." He looked at her, the gray eyes still the most honest thing she had ever been looked at by. "That is not my work," he said. "That was yours." She nodded. She looked at the fence, and then at her land, and then at him. The sun was doing its late afternoon thing, the amber light, and he was standing in it the way he had stood in it that first time on the hill when she had asked what he was thinking, and the answer he gave her that day came back to her now, that she was the most determined person he had encountered in 8 years of this country, and that the land was lucky to have her on it. "We are lucky," she said. "Both of us." "Yes," he said, without qualification. She took his hand, the large weathered hand that she knew as well as she knew her own, and they stood together on the fence line between their 2 pieces of land, her land, his land, both separate and both theirs, which was exactly how it ought to be, and looked at the country spread around them in the late summer afternoon, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific, abundant fullness of a life that had been built exactly as it should be, on honest ground, with honest hands, and by people who had chosen each other freely and completely, and knew the difference between that and every other kind of choosing. The children were up at the house. Thomas would be looking after Samuel, and Clara would be ignoring Thomas's attempts to look after her, which was entirely correct. There was supper to make and accounts to finish, and tomorrow the cattle in the north pasture needed moving to the creek access, and there were probably 40 things Lydia would think of between now and morning. There was always more to do. The ranch was always asking something of her, and she was always answering, and the answer was always her own. She held her husband's hand in the afternoon light and breathed the smell of the panhandle in summer, dry grass and cedar, and something that was simply the smell of the place itself, her place. And she was 31 years old and healthy, and standing on land she owned, and in love with a man who had never once tried to tell her who to be. And the fence between their properties was in good repair, and every post was solid, and the wire was straight and taut and running clean to the horizon. It was, she thought, exactly what she had wanted, all of it down to the last post. She turned and looked at Jedediah Garrett one more time, and he was looking back at her, and everything that needed to be said between them had been said, and everything that hadn't been said yet would be said in time. And the sky above the panhandle of Texas in the summer of 1883 went on in all directions, wide and clear and full of weather and light, and they stood in it together, which was exactly where they both chose to be.